Hello and welcome to Dialogue. 26 Western countries said they are ready to deploy troops to Ukraine in a reassurance force the day after a ceasefire is agreed. This was announced by French President Emmanuel Macron after France and the UK co-hosted a summit for the Coalition of the Willing on Thursday, where 35 countries were represented to discuss how to provide post-war security for Ukraine. Macron also said U.S. support would be finalized in the coming days. How credible is this EU commitment? Will the U.S. join the move? And what has been the Russian response? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Join me today are Andrey Kortunov, Academic Director of the Russian International Affairs Council, Professor Anton Fedyashin at American University, Professor Diesen at the University of Southeastern Norway, and Ruslan, Bortnik, Director of the Ukrainian Institute of Politics. Welcome to the show. So Glenn, I will start with you. It happened in Paris. Obviously, 35 countries expressed support for Ukraine. After the meeting, French President Macron stated that 26 of those nations have agreed to formally commit troops to Ukraine, quote, by land, sea or air, the day after a ceasefire is agreed. But the problem is we do see there's a lack of details as to specific rules of those forces, timelines, mandates, etc. So how credible is the European commitment here?
Well, it doesn't seem very credible at all. And also, well, the way it's been framed after a ceasefire, this so-called, which amounts to a threat of putting European troops into Ukraine, prevents any ceasefire from taking place, because keep in mind that this was the main reason for Russia to invade in 2022 to begin with, was to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, to prevent NATO weapons to be placed within Ukraine. So this would simply be interpreted as a possible stepping stone towards pulling Ukraine deeper into the NATO orbit. It's obviously would have more of a function as a tripwire to prevent, to try to rescue the situation, because things are going from bad to worse very quickly. But again, I think at the heart of it, it's very delusional, because the French government's already in deep trouble, and a lot of the problems you can see across the continent. There's a problem with the funding. There's a shortage of military equipment. There's social problems. And also the political leadership in a lot of these countries struggle now with credibility, with many of these governments looking very weak. So it looks as if this is an effort to dictate the terms after effectively losing the war. But I think the main purpose is to encourage Zelensky to continue fighting on, but also show to Trump that the Europeans still are standing strong and they're able to make great commitments. But again, it doesn't actually amount to anything. It doesn't look like they can actually pull through what they're promising. And it's worth noting that afterwards, President Putin made a comment about this in Vladivostok at the Eastern Economic Forum, where he argued that all troops which would be placed in Ukraine would become legitimate targets for the Russian army. So it doesn't really seem credible. The Europeans can't really do much without the United States backing any of this up.
Right, not security or themselves could be the target there. Ruslan, if you look at the commitment from the European countries right now, so what kind of role do you think those reassurance force is to play in Ukraine?
Also a very difficult question, because Ukraine already has European assurance. We are talking about the Budapest Memorandum from 1994. Now we are looking not assurances, we are looking for guarantees. It's a big difference if we are talking about the government, if we are talking about the management of the state. But the main problem for nowadays for Ukraine that Ukraine and Western allies are not still able to agree the model of security guarantees for Ukraine. So because we don't have nothing to put in front of a Russian leadership to start the real trade negotiation with the Russian leadership about the future security and political balance around Ukraine. Why we don't have such a security guarantees model for now? Because there are at least two problems. The first problem, Ukraine wants to achieve the permanent presence of Western troops in Ukrainian lands. Ukraine is not ready to accept the guarantees or assurances without permanent military presence of our allies. And the second problem is it's a question of how deep United States are ready to take part in these security guarantees. It looks like the United States is not ready to take part in any security guarantees which could lead to the situation of a straight fight or so straight competitiveness between Russia and United States. But European allies of Ukraine, they are very weak in their own ability to give Ukraine such a security guarantees. So because we have still a huge problem in the West, between West and Ukraine, with this topic of security guarantees, and it's also a reason and a source growing political conflict between the United States and Europe on this issue, because everybody very disappointed of each other in this moment. And this is the reason why we don't have still any real security model which could be put it on the public and be discussed by the sides.
Well, Andrey, what about the force, from the Russian side? Would the force be, do you think they are ready or they are prepared for military confrontation, in some of the situations, because they are military forces over there? I mean, as President Putin said, they could be the legitimate target of the Russian forces. So do you see a security guarantee there, or do you see there could be potentially a trouble, hotspot even?
Well, of course, the devil is always in details. A lot will depend on whether any foreign presence on the Ukrainian territory will be a result of a peace settlement, or it will come before a political settlement of the conflict. If the conflict goes on as it does right now, I think that indeed Russia would emphatically oppose any kind of foreign presence in Ukraine, and indeed foreign troops might be considered legitimate targets. However, we can imagine a situation that someone will have to monitor the implementation of a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine, and there might be some observers. After all, we had such observers for many years, commissioned by OSCE after Minsk II agreements were signed. So a lot will depend on what they agree upon. But I can imagine that if indeed at some point any peacekeeping units are going to be deployed in Ukraine, that should be a decision endorsed by the United Nations Security Council, and then, of course, Russia can veto any presence which it will not accept. So a lot will depend on how it goes. But right now, any foreign engagement will be considered as a kind of horizontal escalation of the conflict.
Well, Anton, some say much of the point for Thursday's Paris summit was to convince U.S. President Donald Trump to back the plan. Some commentators say, without the participation of the USA, all the talk of the coalition of the William will remain words on paper, just rhetoric there. How likely will U.S. join this commitment?
Highly unlikely, Chindu. The Americans have already said so on multiple occasions, and if the Americans didn't come in militarily with boots on the ground under Joe Biden, who was much more committed to Ukraine than Trump. There is absolutely no chance that this will happen in the next 3 years that Trump is in office. And to be honest with you, I seriously doubt that if the American people elect a Democratic president after Trump, that person will do the same, because the level of support for engagement in Ukraine on all levels, financial, in terms of military supplies, but not military direct involvement, it is declining across the West and in the United States also. So the Americans are not going to put troops on the ground, nor are some of the most important European countries. The Poles, who have been very much behind the Ukrainians on supplies and many other things, taking in refugees, the Poles have ruled it out. So have the Germans. So these games that we saw in Paris by a bunch of politicians, especially Emmanuel Macron, whose government is facing a vote of no confidence on Monday and may collapse. This is all political theater. Let me just remind our audience that Ukraine's already signed 25 bilateral agreements with Western nations that have committed to support it, not with troops on the ground, but with all sorts of security arrangements. And here we are talking about the same thing again, which tells me that those agreements that had been signed were not worth the paper they were written on. Incidentally, the Biden administration signed a bilateral agreement with Ukraine on the 13th of June of 2024. Our viewers can go back and look at the Western press and its coverage about that. So the United States is not going in. Without the U.S., the Europeans are not going to be able to do anything. And everyone will have to wait for a peace settlement to come. And all of that depends entirely on the Russians and the Ukrainians striking a compromise agreement.
Well, Anton, interestingly, Trump joined the meeting by phone, and he listed actually his demand that the Europeans must stop purchasing Russian oil and gas, and also they need to increase economic pressure on China to bring about an end to the war. Do you think the Europeans can afford, to do that?
Of course they can't afford to do that. The European economies are suffering under massive financial problems, none more so than France, which is the most active mover, champion, pioneer of the placement of European NATO troops on Ukrainian soil. I think Trump understands the problems that the Europeans are facing, and he's simply making demands of them that he knows they cannot possibly carry out. And this gives him the opportunity to say, look, to the American people, and especially to Congress, which is now back in session, he's going to say, look, I tried. I did everything I possibly could, but the Europeans, those pesky Europeans, they couldn't get their act together. So we're just walking away. And so Trump has been trying to extricate the United States from what he's concluded is a lost war, and he's trying to outsource the war to parties that are simply incapable of sourcing it on their own.
Glenn, one of the requirements from Trump is like the Europeans to increase economic pressure on China. What are they going to do? If they say, oh, yes, we will do that. And besides, if you look at what happened to India, despite the 50% increase of tariffs on India, and they said they are going to increase their purchase of oil from Russia. Obviously, Washington or Brussels, there's little they can do to big powers like China, like India.
Well, the Europeans, as well as the Americans, have sanctioned everything there is to sanction on Russia, and they exhausted this sanctions weapon. Again, this is the only tool in the toolbox, so they continue to go for new threats. But the step they're now suggesting is essentially to put sanctions on the world with these secondary sanctions. And you're very correct. So far, all the indications come through suggest this is not going to work. China and Russia just signed now a deal on the Power of Siberia 2, which will take all this gas, which was intended to Europe, and redirect it to China instead. And as you also suggested, as India has now said, they're also going to increase their economic cooperation with Russia. So no one is actually bowing to any of the pressure from the Europeans. But I think there's a lot of panic going on in Europe. They don't really know what to do. There's a bit of a strategic vacuum. There's a struggle to remain relevant. There's a struggle to have any influence. The political leaders are also having some legitimacy problems. It's worth noting that the Europeans initially were considered the ones who were a bit more cautious in terms of going against Russia. But the Europeans bet everything on the strategic defeat of Russia. With the US leading the charge, the Europeans all joined in, and we lost this proxy war. And now the Americans are looking to pull out and hand over responsibility to the Europeans. And so they're very vulnerable. Now they have to essentially sign any agreements the Americans put in front of them, and making it so much worse that the United States want to walk away from this. They don't really know any longer what to do. So I think these are empty threats. They can't afford it either. The European economies are now struggling. We're having deindustrialization in countries like Germany. There's talk about France and the UK needing IMF bailout support. The debts are becoming increasingly less sustainable, and making matters worse. The first reflex is always to try to threaten other countries by cutting off their access to technologies, banks, the SWIFT system, transportation corridors. But instead of the world falling in line, we see then India, China leading the way. They're essentially setting up alternatives. So a lot of this is counterproductive. We're seeing and I think this is what we saw also now with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, that they're looking for ways to, instead of bowing to the pressure of the Europeans and others, learn to a greater extent live without them.
Yes, well, the old system is not working that properly, let's say, and the dominance, it's hard to continue there. But Ruslan, if you look at the European countries inside themselves, you do see, different countries have different kind of reaction. For example, I earlier mentioned Poland, Germany, Italy have said they will not deploy troops to Ukraine. And then there's a concern of course, like, whether they will be, say, having themselves up to a potential conflict with Russia, or whether the US will have their backup there. So now you see kind of like there are three camps basically inside the European countries. One camp of camp of no's probably, or the maybe camp, or the yes camp to the troop deployment in Ukraine. What do you make of that? Do you think why there is such a division?
Because nobody in Europe is sure that nowadays European strategy toward Ukraine is beneficial and is a winning strategy for the future. I'll try also to give some short answer for your previous question about the Trump's demand to Europe, for example, to make a sanctions towards China. I think it was a political trolling from Trump's administration and from Trump's personally, because now Europe is trying to demand from Trump to accelerate Trump's policy, United States policy towards Russia, to make a bigger pressure towards Russia, to make a bigger pressure to the trade allies of the Russia. And so because Trump is trying to back this policy and claiming and convincing Europe, accusing Europe in this moment, in non-coherent, not honesty policy. If you are demanding from my side to accelerate the policy towards Russia and her allies, why you don't do so? Why you are buying the Russian energy not only through the pipeline but also through LNG from another resources? Why are you continuing the trade with Russia? Why the majority of Western companies which now are still working in Russia, they are European companies, not United States companies, European companies. So because Trump is trying to give it back, please show Europe, please show example of an honest, of a coherent policy, and maybe I will think about it's over. But now Europe is very divided, and only three main countries of Europe, Germany, France, and Great Britain, the government in which of this country is not very popular, and in each of this country we have a most popular opposition party now. All these three countries are trying to maintain the previous Biden's policy toward Ukraine and Russia, the policy of exhaustion of Russia, the policy of keeping the war, the policy of fighting the a model of defeating the Russia, because of many reasons, because of reason of competitive with Trump and Republicans and conservators in Europe and the United States, because of reason of the money. These countries are keeping more than 200 billion Russian frozen assets, because of power inside of Europe, because the war and the danger of the future war makes these governments stronger, let this government to use a lot of public money to the military goals and so on. So there is a scope of reasons why these three governments now are trying to maintain the previous policy. Also, we have a couple of countries which are allies of these countries, and also we have a couple of countries which are against this policy or trying to be neutral or trying to be in the direction of the Trump administration.
Right, and Andrey, if you look at the response from the European countries, the NATO, for example, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said, he talked about the size of Russia. He says roughly the size of the U.S. state of Texas. He, laughed at Putin, compared Putin to be the governor of Texas. And he said, the troop deployment in Ukraine should not be dictated by Russia. That's a sovereign state. But what's your take on that? And also, can you imagine, so there's a troop deployment of, say, Russian troops and other troops from other countries in Canada or in Mexico, and the U.S. will not be concerned?
Well, it's not really a new position taken by the NATO Secretary General. I recall Barack Obama made a statement that Russia was essentially a regional power and its economy was completely destroyed. And of course, rhetorically, we understand why they are making such statements, but these statements are not accurate because they have to deal with Russia and they have to take Russia seriously. And that's something that cannot be denied. So the question is whether security guarantees is something that can be considered within the overall peace process, or it is something that will precede the peace agreement. And that makes a big difference, because if indeed security guarantees to Ukraine are something within a broader European security framework, I think this is fine with Moscow. Putin understands that Ukraine will need security guarantees, but Putin insists that Russia also has a right to claim security guarantees. Therefore, what we need is a new European security architecture in which every single European country would feel comfortable and not threatened by others. And this is clearly not an easy goal to reach. Right now, there is no trust. We have a military confrontation in the center of the continent. But if we want to make sure that nothing like this conflict will happen again in the foreseeable future, we need to take a more general, more comprehensive approach to the European security.
Mm-hmm. Anton, I think Andrew made a good point of like a European-wide security structure. I mean, that, of course, taking that into consideration, and then you think about this ongoing, let's say, efforts to achieve a ceasefire or a peace deal. Do you think that will deal with the root causes of this conflict, and then other security issues of European countries, Ukraine, Russia, that will be dealt with effectively?
If this the peace settlement really does address the general architecture of Europe, then yes. But the U.S. role in this is a very big question for me. First of all, without U.S. involvement, the Europeans will not want to negotiate a security settlement vis-a-vis the Russians because they've been sitting under the American security umbrella for 60 years now during the entirety of the Cold War, and they've gotten used to it. It's saved them a lot of money, and that's why Europe has one of the highest standards of living in the world and states that take care of their citizens. Europe, by the way, is beginning to exit that period of its history because with remilitarization, those days are over. And by the way, there are European officials, including Chancellor Merz, who have openly, publicly admitted that this is true. So the Americans are going to have to be in. But from the American perspective, a Eurasia, the whole continent, as a stable, integrated continent also doesn't make sense because there are a lot of neoliberals and neoconservatives in this town who still see the world according to what Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, one of the brightest minds on the American geopolitical concepts firmament, whether you agree with him or disagree, but they still see the world in terms of the book that he published in 1997 called The Grand Chessboard, in which he described the overall American strategy for decades to come, which was to prevent any kind of great power from emerging in Eurasia and to use Eurasian disagreements, be they in Europe or in the Far East or in Central Asia or in South Asia, to use these disagreements and points of pressure in order to ensure American dominance over the continent. That decade, that era is also passing, as we saw at the SCO meeting in China, as we see with the BRICS meetings every year. But the United States is going to resist. Trump's working against this establishment also. So this is going to be a very slow and very protracted process. And unfortunately for the Ukrainians, they are on the fault line of this tectonic shift that we're all living through in the modern era.
Glenn, lastly, do you think, are you optimistic we are going to have a ceasefire and or even a peace deal, given what Anton has said, taking into consideration concerns of all parties, and that will be a permanent solution to the issues?
Well, the problem is that the whole premise of the ceasefire as a solution was the idea that Russia just woke up one day and wanted some new territories and began to invade Ukraine. The problem is that there is a need to address the root causes, as Russians keep saying. And in all fairness, the Russians have been very consistent about this. For the past 30 years, they've been talking about the concept of indivisible security, that one side shouldn't enhance its security at the expense of the other side. And this is why when the Europeans only want to discuss the security guarantees for the Ukrainians, but refuse to discuss security guarantees for Russia, this is based on the same principle. It's worth remembering, though, that in the beginning of the 90s, we actually made agreements for a European security architecture, such as the Charter of Paris for New Europe in 1990, which was based on this idea of indivisible security. But again, we instead went with a hegemonic peace, which entailed NATO expansion. And for the past 30 years, the Russians have been complaining that NATO is enhancing its security at the expense of Russian security. So if you want to address this problem of the war in Ukraine, because this war is a symptom of the larger collapse of the pan-European security architecture.
Right.
If you want to solve this problem,
you
have to address the wider problem of the European security architecture. This is not something that can be solved
Okay, Glenn,
with a ceasefire.
We have to stop there. Well, on that note, we are coming to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.